heaven's form, which determines how people associate and communicate there. To some extent, we can determine what heaven's form is like on the basis of what has been presented in the preceding chapters. That heaven has a basic similarity in its greatest and its smallest instances, that therefore each community is a heaven in lesser form, and each angel in least form, that as heaven as a whole resembles a single person, so every community of heaven resembles a person in lesser form, and every individual angel in least form. That the wisest people are at the center, with the less wise around them all the way to the borders, and that the same holds true for each community, and that people who are engaged in the good of love live along the east-west axis, and people who are engaged in truths that derive from the good along the south-north axis, which also holds true for each community. All these things are determined by heaven's form, so we can figure out what that form is like in a general sense. We need to know what heaven's form is like because it determines not only how angels associate with each other, but also how all their communication takes place. And since all their communication is also an outreach of their thoughts and affections, this means all their intelligence and wisdom. This is why the extent to which we are in heaven's form, or our forms of heaven, determines how wise we are. It amounts to the same thing whether you say in heaven's form or in heaven's design, since the form of any entity comes from its design and is determined by it. However, for the image or form of heaven to be restored for us, we need to be educated in the principles of the design, for the form, as explained above, depends on the design. The word contains all the laws of the divine design, for the laws of the divine design are the precepts we find there. To the extent that we know them and live by them, our inner being is opened, and in it the design or form of heaven is formed anew. We can see from this what it is to be in heaven's form, namely, it is living according to what is in the Word. To the extent that people are in heaven's form, they are in heaven, and are in fact a heaven in least form. Further, they live in intelligence and wisdom to that same extent, for as already noted, all the thought of our intellect and all the affection of our volition reach out round about us in heaven according to its form, and communicate wonderfully with the communities there, and they in turn communicate with us. There are people who believe that their thoughts and affections do not really reach out around them, but are inside them, because they see what they are thinking as inside themselves and not as remote from themselves. They are sadly mistaken, though, for just as our eyesight reaches out to remote objects and is affected in keeping with the patterns that it sees in that outreach, so our inner sight, which is an attribute of our intellect, has an outreach in the spiritual world, even though, for reasons presented above, we do not perceive it. The only difference is that our eyesight is affected on the natural level, because it is made of materials from the natural world, while the sight of our intellect is affected spiritually, because it is made of materials in the spiritual world that all have to do with what is good and true. The reason we do not know that this is the case is that we do not know that there is a certain light that illumines our understanding. Yet without the light that illumines our understanding, we would be incapable of thinking anything. There was one particular spirit who believed that he thought independently, that is, without any outreach beyond himself and therefore communication with the surrounding communities. So that he might learn that he was wrong, he was deprived of any communication with nearby communities. As a result, he not only lost the power of thinking, but actually collapsed lifelessly, just flailing his arms like a newborn baby. In a little while, the communication was restored, and bit by bit, as it was restored, he returned to his usual state of thinking. Some other spirits who saw this then admitted that all their thought and affection was flowing in according to this communication, and since this was true of all their thought and affection, it was true of their whole life as well, since all our life consists of our ability to think and to be affected, or in other words, to understand and intend. We need to realize, though, that intelligence and wisdom vary for individuals depending on the communication. For people whose intelligence and wisdom are formed from things genuinely good and true, there is a sharing with communities according to heaven's form. While for people whose intelligence and wisdom are not formed from things genuinely good and true, but only from things that are in accord with them, the communication is intermittent and only partially coherent because it is not with communities in the sequence characteristic of heaven's form. However, because people who are not in intelligence and wisdom at all are caught up in false notions that stem from their evils, they have a sharing with communities in hell. The outreach depends on the extent to which their attitudes have been internalized. It should also be known that this sharing with communities is not something that comes to the overt perception of the people involved in it, but is a communication with the quality in which they participate and which reaches out from them. All the people in heaven are grouped according to spiritual affinities, which are matters of what is good and true in their pattern, the same way in the whole heaven as in each community and in each household. This is why angels who are involved in similar good and true activities recognize each other the way relatives and kindred spirits do on earth, just as though they had known each other from infancy. The good and true elements that make up intelligence and wisdom are similarly arranged within each individual angel. They recognize each other in much the same way, and as they recognize each other, they unite. As a result, people in whom things good and true are united, according to heaven's form, see things that follow in their sequence, and how things fit together far and wide around them. It is different for people in whom things good and true are not united according to heaven's form. In each heaven, this is the form that determines communication and the outreach of thoughts and affections for angels, and therefore determines their intelligence and wisdom. The communication of one heaven with another, though, is different, that of the third or inmost heaven with the second or intermediate, and of these two with the first or outmost. In fact, the communication between heavens should not be called communication, but inflow, which we now need to say something about. We have previously explored the topic of the three heavens and their differences. We may conclude from the way the heavens are situated in relation to each other that there is not a communication of one heaven with another, but an inflow. The third or inmost heaven is above, the second or intermediate is lower, and the first or outmost is still lower. It is much the same for all the communities of each heaven. For example, there are some in lofty places that look like mountains, with people from the inmost heavens living on their summits, people from the second heaven below them, and below them again people from the outmost heaven. It is like this everywhere, whether in lofty areas or in lowly ones. A community of a higher heaven does not have any communication with a community of a lower heaven, except by means of correspondences. And communication by correspondences is what is called inflow. One heaven is united to another, or a community of one heaven with a community of another, by the Lord alone, through a direct and an indirect inflow. The direct is from himself, and the indirect is sequential through the higher heavens into the lower ones. Since the union of the heavens through inflow is accomplished by the Lord alone, the greatest possible precautions are taken to prevent any angel from a higher heaven from looking down into a community of a lower one and talking with anyone there. The moment this happens, the angel will lose intelligence and wisdom. The reason needs to be stated. Every angel has 3 levels of life, like the 3 levels of heaven. For the ones in the inmost heaven, the third or inmost level is opened, and the second and first are closed. For people in the intermediate heaven, the second level is opened, and the first and third are closed. And for people in the outermost heaven, the first level is opened and the second and third are closed. The moment an angel of the third heaven, then, looks down into a community of the second and talks with anyone there, the third level of that angel is closed. And when it is closed, the angel is deprived of wisdom, because her or his wisdom dwells on the third level, with none on the second and first. This is the meaning of the Lord's words in Matthew. Let those who are on the roof not come down to take what is in the house, and let those who are in the field not turn back to take their garments. Matthew 24:17-18. And in Luke, let those who are on the roof on that day while their belongings are in the house not go down to get them, and let those who are in the field not turn back to what is behind them. Remember Lot's wife. Luke 17:31-32. There's no inflow from lower heavens into higher ones, because this goes against the design. Rather, inflow is from the higher ones into the lower. The wisdom of angels of a higher heaven surpasses the wisdom of angels of a lower one by a ratio of thousands to 1. This is also why angels of a lower heaven cannot talk with angels of a higher one. In fact, when they look in their direction, they do not see them. Their heaven looks like something cloudy overhead. However, angels of a higher heaven can see people who are in a lower heaven, though they are not allowed to carry on conversations with them to prevent them from losing their wisdom, as already mentioned. The thoughts, the affections, and the conversations of angels of the inmost heaven are wholly beyond the perception of angels in the intermediate heaven, because they are so transcendent. But when it pleases the Lord, they are visible in the lower heavens as something flame-like from the higher one, while conversations in the intermediate heaven are seen as something shining in the outmost heaven, sometimes as a bright iridescent cloud. The lower angels can to some extent tell what the higher ones are saying from the way the cloud rises and descends and from its form. This enables us to conclude what heaven's form is like, namely that it is most perfect of all in the inmost heaven, perfect in the intermediate heaven, but less so, and still less so in the heaven below that. We can also conclude that the form of one heaven is maintained by another through the inflow from the Lord. However, there is no way to understand what communication by inflow is like without knowing what vertical levels are like and what the difference is between these levels and degrees of length and breadth. As to heaven's form and how it works and flows, this is incomprehensible even to angels. It can be brought to some measure of conceptualization by comparison with the form of all the elements of the human body as explored and examined by someone who is both wise and experienced. For as explained above in the relevant chapters, heaven as a whole resembles a single person, and everything in the human body corresponds to the heavens. We can see in a general way how incomprehensible and intricate this form is, simply by looking at our nerve fibers, which serve to weave absolutely everything in us together. There is no way their nature and how they work and flow in the brain can be presented to our eyes, for the countless things involved are so intricate that viewed en masse they look like a soft, undefined lump. Yet actually, each and every function of our volition and understanding flows into act through them with perfect definition. We can see how these fibers rejoin in the body by looking at the various plexuses, cardiac, mesenteric, and others, and the nodes called ganglia, where many fibers from all over the body come together, combining within these nodes and then exiting in different arrangements to various functions, a pattern that is repeated over and over again. Further, there are similar arrangements in all our viscera, in each member and organ and muscle. Anyone who probes these and other wonders with the eye of wisdom will be utterly stunned. And yet, these are the few things that the eye can see, and what it cannot see is more amazing still because it is more inward in nature. It is abundantly clear that this form corresponds to heaven's form, if we consider the way our volition and discernment work in it, and according to it, because whatever we intend flows spontaneously into act, and whatever we think travels along the fibers from their beginnings to their ends, giving rise to our senses. Further, since this is the form of our thought and intentions, it is the form of our intelligence and wisdom. It is this form that corresponds to heaven's form. We can learn from this that it is this kind of form that determines the way all the affection and thought of angels reaches out, and that they enjoy intelligence and wisdom to the extent that they are in this form. It may be seen above that this form of heaven comes from the Lord's divine human. These matters have been included so that it may also be known that heaven's form, by its very nature, can never be fathomed even in a general way, and is thus incomprehensible even to angels.